Hello, today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the U.S. Constitution. Do take a look at the Constitution, and you can find it online or in the appendix of your book, and take a look at a few of the things in there. Now, a couple of things I do want to point out quickly. One thing is it does give you some information about the powers of Congress and the judiciary and the executive branch, including the president. One power of Congress is to regulate commerce with foreign nations, among the several states, and with the Indian tribes. That's the Commerce Clause, and it can be applied, especially the interstate commerce. If there's commerce that affects things in other states outside of your state, then Congress can regulate that. Another important clause is the Supremacy Clause, which says the Constitution and the laws of the United States and treaties, etc., shall be the supreme law of the land. And that's the Supremacy Clause. And we've already mentioned before in other scenarios that the Constitution is superior in terms of priority over other laws. And federal law will preempt or overrule any state law that conflicts with it. Now, there are amendments to the Constitution which do apply to government action. Do remember that these amendments are not saying that your boss cannot tell you what you can say at work, for example. So if you're answering the phones at a business and you want to answer the phones with some sort of religious statement or political statement, your boss can tell you no. Because the First Amendment, while it does guarantee freedom of speech here and freedom of religion, as you can see, Congress shall make no law respecting established religion or the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech. It doesn't say your boss cannot regulate that, but it does say Congress cannot. So these first 10 amendments are called the Bill of Rights. There's some other amendments, and they're dealing with what can the government do and what is the government prohibited from doing to regulate your speech, your religion, and so forth. And generally, it's not about what can your employer keep you from doing in terms of that. So your employer may be able to tell you cannot, talk about your religion to clients or customers at work. Another very important one is the 14th Amendment, including the Due Process Clause, which is basically, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law, which is the Equal Protection Clause. So do keep these in your mind as we go through this chapter. All right. So I do want to mention a few other clauses. One is the Contract Clause, which does say that states, such as Arkansas, cannot enact laws that impact rights and duties under existing contracts. Now, this Contract Clause does not apply to the federal government. So if the federal government wishes to enact laws that impact rights and duties under existing contracts, they can. So, for example, if you and I have a contract and then the state wants to come back and say we're going to impact that or make it invalid or something, states cannot do that. One exception is state laws passed during emergency situations. This could be approved. Now, I do want you to notice a few things. First of all, basic constitutional rights are not absolute. And the extent of a limitation on a constitutional guarantee depends on the nature of the competing public policy. Let me give you a good example of this. One of the things that I do want to show you here, let me get to it, is, let's see, the Art on Trial site is what I wanted to look at. This is a man who made a tattoo. He liked to give tattoos as part of his business. This is artistic expression. But South Carolina said, no, you cannot do this. It's against the law because we only allow licensed physicians to give tattoos. This man who did the tattoo said that's unconstitutional regulation of my speech. The court said it is not unconstitutional. It is not a violation of freedom of speech because, once again, basic constitutional rights are not absolute. There can be regulations on speech, and the extent of a limitation on a constitutional guarantee like freedom of speech depends on the nature of the competing public policy. In this case, South Carolina had a good argument. They felt that a licensed physician is the only person who should give a tattoo because of their concerns about infection and health problems that could result from unsanitary conditions by people who may give tattoos. And so the court bought that and said, hey, no First Amendment protection for this tattoo. Now, a tattoo is speech. It's artistic speech, but it was not protected in this case because there was an important, compelling, competing public policy that kind of overruled the freedom of speech. Now, the First Amendment deals with freedom of religion, freedom of speech. It also deals with commercial speech and freedom of press. Now, freedom of religion, there's an establishment clause that says Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion. So Congress and the government cannot say a certain religion is the religion that everyone must have. And so, for example, if someone chooses at a high school football game to have a prayer that is only a Christian prayer, they can run into trouble under the Establishment Clause because it appears that at a public school, now private schools are a different matter, but at a public school that would make it appear as if a government institution is establishing Christianity as the religion of that government institution. Private schools would not have the same issues. Free Exercise Clause is dealing with prohibiting the free exercise of religion. And that's most of the business-related freedom of religion cases deal with that. So if someone says, I need every Sunday off from work, and the employer says, well, I'm sorry, you can't have that because that's my busiest day, the employee may have some questions about free exercise of their religion. And that's the more likely business case. Speech can cover verbal and written communication. It's basically expression. Now, it doesn't protect you from your private company boss because the Constitution is dealing with these amendments are dealing with what can the government prohibit you from saying. And so keep that in mind. It does protect symbolic speech, such as burning an American flag in protest, but there are some things that are not protected, such as fighting words and obscenity. And also the regulation of speech. Government restrictions on speech must be very narrowly drafted. You can't make it super, super broad. So a good example of that would be this case. Let's see. Where a government said, we don't like this image on beer bottles. We think this is bad for children to see in the grocery store. And so we want this gone. Well, the government really can't just say no speech at all. This is not obscenity. It may be offensive to some people, but it's not obscenity. And so the court said, no, you can't do that. You might have a shot if you were less broad and you just said we're going to regulate the speech. But since you're being so broad as to say get rid of it, it's not going to work. Regulation could include putting this on high shelves in the grocery store, somehow making it less visible to children by putting it in a special section. And you could go on about some restrictions that could work, but they don't need to be too broad. And that's referred to as the overbreadth doctrine. Now, one example of freedom of speech is the Snyder versus Phelps case, which is basically dealing with picketing at funerals of Marines. The father of a Marine, Snyder, claimed and sued the church for causing emotional distress and invasion of privacy. And so how did this go? Well, let's look at those pictures. This is the kind of stuff that this church would bring to funerals of soldiers. You're going to hell. Thank God for dead soldiers, and so forth. Basically saying that the United States is an immoral nation and the soldiers deserve to die because of that. Those types of things. Well, this did upset the family, but apparently the church stayed far enough away from the funeral that the family could barely see the signs or the tops of the signs. They did not physically interfere with the funeral. And so even though a lot of people find this terribly offensive, it is a speech or expression that's dealing with things that are matters of morality and public policy. And so it is protected. And the court said, we're not going to say that this family was a captive audience. And so we're going to basically say that since the picketing did not disrupt the funeral, we're going to protect the church, and they are allowed to do this. And they are not liable for the tort of invasion of privacy or emotional distress. So the First Amendment does prohibit holding Westboro liable for speech. All right. Also, one other thing to remember is commercial speech is protected. Freedom of speech protects corporations and individuals. It protects the listener and the speaker. Not as extensive as the individual rights. If there's a good state interest at stake, the government can limit commercial speech, but that's only then. All right. Let me stop here and thank you for listening, and don't hesitate to contact me if you do have questions.